Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start, and I'm going to record this one so I can post it to our YouTube channel as well. We're doing a Facebook live feed, so welcome everyone online, whoever happens to be watching. And my son started this Facebook live thing with his GoPro, so hopefully that works. My name is Adam, and we're going to be covering, this class is designed to help you prepare for the ham radio test. There's 3 levels of licenses. There's the technician, the general, and the extra. We'll be using this book, and I'll be posting information and links and stuff on the Facebook group, which is facebook.com/groups/Saratoga Springs Ham Radio. I live in Saratoga Springs, Utah, and so people near and wide may be joining. So I'm just going to treat it as if it were a live, broadcast, but we also have a few friends here and neighbors that are also joining us. So I'm going to be posting this on the group. I haven't yet posted it, but this is the syllabus for the class. So the first, I'm going to try to do 7 weeks. It might go 8 weeks or 9. And what we might do is take 1 week off between now and then, like maybe President's Day or something like that, depending on what everyone's schedule is. So we'll take one of those Tuesdays off, and then we'll resume back. That way it's not whole bunch at once, and give you some time to kind of study and absorb some of it and then come back again. So my thought is that we will do an hour class each time and keep it in 60 minutes. And if you want to stay after, we can have discussions or talks or any more. That's, if you want to stay longer, you can, but I'm going to try to keep it in 60 minutes. And so the syllabus here kind of covers week 1 through 7. And then week 8, we could do a review with the question pool and answers. I have taught this class 3 or 4 times before, but it's been about 15 years. And every 4 years, they update the test questions. And they actually have made it easier over the years. So there's technician, general, and extra. Okay, that's level 1, 2, and 3. I have the level 1 license. And that gives you access to what are called VHF and UHF frequencies. For the HF, the high frequencies, where you can go further and talk longer distances, requires the general license. And back when I took it, it was 35 questions, or maybe it was 50. I think it was 50 questions. The technician is 35. It was 50 questions plus a Morse code test. And I always thought, one day I'd like to learn Morse code for emergencies, but I never did. And that gave me the motivation to do it. I learned it, and you had to have a speed requirement, words per minute. And it was 5 words per minute. And I got about 3 words per minute. So I failed the Morse code part, but I passed the written. But they didn't give me my general. And so I just never went back and did it. Well, as the hobby has kind of waned in interest, they have tried to make it easier to get in order to keep a number of people in. And so they got rid of the Morse code requirement a few years ago. So you no longer have to do it. I could probably go back and take it, but I haven't done it. But I have taught this when I lived in Denver, Colorado, in the Aurora Stick. I taught it 2 or 3 times, did a couple sessions over a year or 2. And I had adults, old and young, about 20, 30 people. I had a 12-year-old pass it. As young as 6, they say, can pass it. So the nice thing about this book is they have the test questions and answers in the back. The FCC publishes all of the test questions and the answers. So there's a test bank of about 200 questions or so, and they randomly pull 35 from those 200, and they just randomly give you that. It's multiple choice, or multiple guess, as you might say. So if you recognize the concept and you're familiar with it, you have a pretty good idea of what the test is. There's groups of subject matter areas. There's 5 or 6 different groups of test questions, and so they'll ask you a couple questions from each of those subject matters areas to total 35 questions. So this tells you the subject elements. They're called sub-elements. On chapter 10, and then they go into the questions. So this is just one sample test. There are 2 or 3 websites that I'll refer you to that do free practice tests. So you can just take the practice tests that are the same as the real thing. The only difference is it's not graded. You can just try it again and again until you get it right, and okay, I'm doing pretty good. I'm ready to go take the real thing. So this syllabus has week 1 through 7. There's some helpful pages I've highlighted from each of the chapters. The prior versions of this book used to have like 6 chapters, and now it's 9. It's just smaller chapters broken up. So I put some key ones on here on page 1 and 2. At the bottom of page 2 here, is a test element breakdown, so it tells you the categories. There's 10 subject category areas. FCC rules, procedures, radio wave propagation, amateur radio practices, electrical principles, electronic and electrical components, practical circuits, signals and emissions, antenna and feeds, and then safety. So those are the 10 areas. And on the last page, I have a list of helpful links. So I'll go through a couple of these with you, and then we'll get started on chapter 1. The first one is QRZ.com. They also have free test questions and answers. ARRL is the Amateur Radio Relay League. They're kind of like the, if you were a pilot, it would be AOPA, American Association of Pilots Association. So they're kind of like the union type of thing, or the main organization that supports and advocates for amateur radio. They also, kind of like a, what would you call it? Kind of like the NRA for firearms. It's like the ARRL for radio, right? So they lobby Congress for changes in laws and try to make things favorable for ham radio operators. Ham Radio Outlet, HRO, they are an online store. They had a physical store in Denver, so I used to get a lot of my things from there. They have a great online catalog. I have a couple of their catalogs here where you can get all kinds of equipment, kind of see what type of things they offer. QSL.net, you can get a free email address with your call sign. I've got a link to the manual, the class book that we're going to be using. Also, there's Utah ARES, the Amateur Radio Emergency Service, so there's a link to their website. There's the Utah Valley Amateur Radio Club, Utah VHF Society, which coordinates all the frequencies that amateurs can use. And then there's the link to the Facebook group. Back when I was doing scouts, people who were interested in getting merit badges, they had a amateur radio merit badge, and this would qualify for some of that. So that's a little bit of the syllabus. To tell you about myself, let's see, for those of you who might be tuning in, don't know me, or just like have a friend of a friend who referred you to this, I'll give you a little intro on myself. I already told you I live in Saratoga Springs, Utah. I got a bachelor's in computer science and a master's in computer science, and I just kind of loved technology. Over the years, I've always wanted to do it, and I never did. And so I finally did it about 15 years ago. One of the test questions is, once you get your license, how long is it good for? The answer is 10 years, okay? And all you have to do is just submit a fee. It's like $25 for the next 10 years or something. So I got mine about 20 years ago now. Maybe it was, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It's been a while. So I got it way back when, and I've enjoyed it. There's a lot of things you can do with ham radio, which I'll talk about in a minute. What we're going to try to do is go through the chapters, and at the end I'll pause the recording, and then we can ask questions and have a little in-person conversation of any questions or things you might have. I'm designing it to be sort of follow along with the book, and so I'll go through some of the pages and give you some of my insights and perspectives, and we'll cover the material. So the first one, chapter 1, and the book is organized, instead of page numbers, it's like a section and then a dash and a page number. So like 1-1 is chapter 1, section 1. 2-1 is chapter 2, page 1. So we're going to start with chapter 1, which is sort of welcome to amateur radio. What is it, and why it's useful, and the beginnings of it. On 1-2, it talks about the idea of ham and how that came about. This is kind of funny. It says, how did amateur radio become ham? The real answer is unknown. Even before radio, telegraphers referred to a poor operator as a ham. So you think about like the old days of Morse code and teletype, and like the 1800s or 1900s, when they first set up telegraphs. Perhaps this was derived from a poor operator being ham-fisted on the telegraph key. An operator's fist referred to his or her distinctive style over the wires. With all radio stations sharing the same radio spectrum in the early days, commercial and military operators would sometimes refer to amateurs as hams when there was interference. Regardless, amateurs adopted the term, and it's a badge of honor, and proudly refer to each other as hams to this day. So that's kind of interesting. And believe it or not, in the upper left corner, I want to explain some of the jargon that you may hear on the air as you get on and you start listening. One of the jargon that they use is an Elmer, and an Elmer is a term for a mentor or someone who can teach you ham radio. So there's a little article talking about the March 1971 issue of one of their magazines called QST. And this guy named Rod got a mentor named Elmer, and he was so helpful. And they were talking, and he's like, everyone should have their own Elmer to help them. And so now they say, I will Elmer you, or I will mentor you. So it just means helping. So they have their own lingo. You won't have to learn too much of the lingo, but it is helpful once you get to communicate to understand what people are talking about. And believe it or not, CW or carrier wave, that's a test question, is known as Morse code, is still used today. And at first when I heard it, I was like, really? That's so old. Why would they still use it? But as I've listened to radio, sometimes you hear, like you have the typical commercial of cell phones, like, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? And it breaks up, or it's staticky or whatever. In the analog world of radio waves, it was sometimes hard to hear people. And so as you're talking, your voice can actually become more distorted than hearing tones like do-do-do-da, do-do-do-da. It's easier to hear that sometimes than actual voices. And so there is, especially in low frequencies or hard atmospheric conditions to transmit, Morse code can actually be sometimes better mode of communication than voice, believe it or not. So CW or carrier wave or Morse code is still used. On 1-3, there's a term that you'll have to know this. It's a test question. Well, when I say it's a test question, it's one of the 200. It may or may not be asked. So also keep in mind, if you have an area that's hard for you or difficult, you can miss 6 of them out of the 35 and you'll still pass. So it's like 74% or better or something, you can still pass. So don't feel like you have to know everything, just have the good concepts in mind. So on 1-3, one of the test questions is Oscar. So what is Oscar? And it's not Oscar the Grouch. Okay. Oscar stands for Orbiting Satellite Carrying Amateur Radio. So they have an example here of a cube satellite from the 1950s, I think, or 60s that was used. And it was one of the first amateur radio satellites. So you actually, with your technician license, they give you privileges on the UHF band that you can transmit to satellites. And there are free satellites you can transmit on and receive messages on, which makes it fun and also extends your reach, more than just local VHF, UHF ranges. So satellite communication is something you can do. And so on 1-5, there's an example of a hiker, and you can actually take your radio up in a remote area, and you can hike and take it up really high and talk to people. A lot of amateur radios operators will do what's called contesting, and they'll do contests. Would you hand them a syllabus on the corner there? Oh, you did? Okay. So they'll do what's called contesting, and they will try to do contacts with people. And they'll say, okay, my name is, and they'll give their call sign, and they'll say, I'm located at this area in this time. And they used to do what are called QST, I think? No. They were called Q cards or something, and they would contact each other, write their name, their call sign, and they would get their address, and they'd say, okay, this is me, and they would mail it to them, and then the other person would mail them back, and they would collect cards. And so the more postcards you got, the more people you contacted, and they would do contests. So they do this virtually now. A lot of times you can just go online to a website and say, hey, I made a contact, make it official, and you keep a log of it. Some people like to do that. And so on 1-5, it talks to you about who can be a ham. Anyone from the age of 6 and up. So I had a person, like I was saying earlier, when I've taught this before, who was 12 and passed the test. My son is here with us today, and he's 12, and he's going to try to pass it. So it's kind of like that show, Are You Smarter Than a 5th Grader? He's a 7th grader, so if a 7th grader can pass it, you can too. So it's a good challenge there. So another thing you can actually do is you can contact space station, the International Space Station. So you are allowed to talk to astronauts in orbit. Of course, you have to get on the right frequency and coordinate it and so on. There was an article in the news about 10 years ago of a local elementary school, or no, I think it was a high school in Salt Lake County, and they had planned this for like 2 years. We're going to talk to the astronauts on this time and this date, and if they have enough gap in their experiments and their workload, we'll be able to talk to them. And it worked out. They talked for about 15 minutes to the astronauts. The news media came and they covered it, made a story out of it, and it was kind of fun. And so you can actually talk to astronauts through just a technician license. So they've got some pictures here of the astronauts in 1-7 in the space station. and talking to people. And then 1-6, they talk about the contests that I was talking about. So this is just kind of the intro part of it. Let's see. I don't think so. There's not a lot of test questions in that. Some of these concepts I'm covering, like the word Oscar, the amateur radio carrying satellite, that is a test question. What does it stand for? What is an Oscar? Another thing that ham radio is used to do, 1-9, emergency operations, and that was kind of my motivation to do it, was, in times of emergency, and I'll just share a quick story with you, but in times of emergency and times of peace, amateur radio is used. In times of peace, for example, they use it to coordinate large events like parades and that sort of thing, public safety events. They will use it for the National Weather Service. So when you hear there's a tornado watch or warning or storm warning, it's because they have trained spotters that will go out and spot the weather in the clouds and say, okay, there's a funnel cloud, that's a real one, it's coming down, and they'll talk to the National Weather Service, they relay it, and then they send out a warning or a message. So it's actually used for weather operations as well. So the story for me is, in 1989, I was living in North Carolina, and Hurricane Harvey came in. And we were in this rural area about 50 miles north of Charlotte. We were living in a double-wide mobile home, and there was this forecast. It's about 200 miles inland. We didn't really think it was going to hit, but it did. And we woke up about 4 in the morning to trees crashing, one, another. We woke up the next morning, there was 20 trees just on our little half-acre lot. And we were without power for 2 weeks. And this was before cell phones. And so the telephone line was your telephone, and VHF TV and AM FM radio was your way you interacted wirelessly with the world. And so when the power went out, the telephone system also went out, which a lot of people didn't realize that, the telephone takes electricity to operate too. And so what the telephone company did was they went to each of the little poles every so many miles, and they put up generators to power the poles in the phone system. And a lot of the teenagers were at home because they couldn't go to school, so they got on the phone and started talking. And so it jammed up the lines, and then they were like, well, why don't we get to FM radio station guys and tell them, hey, all the teenagers listening out there, just get off the phone. We need the telephone lines for other things. And the same thing can happen in cell phone networks. In an emergency, voice lines are quickly jammed, and so people will text. But if the power's out for an extended period of time, like days or weeks, those cell phones towers take power to run. Some of them might have batteries for a day or two, may even have a generator, but if it's a week or two, chances are you're not going to have cell phone service. And internet service takes power to run the routers and all the equipment that gets the internet to your house. So even if you have power, your internet may not be working. So a battery-operated ham radio might be one of your few means of communication. Let's see. So let's see how we're doing. 18 minutes. All right. So they also have clubs and organizations. I've talked about a couple in the Utah County area. There's a nationwide one, ARRL. They're a publisher of this book. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about unlicensed radios. Okay. So Palmer, can you get me the FRS radios and one or two of the ham radios? So without getting a license, so if you decide you don't want to take the test, there are what are called FRS. It stands for Family Radio Service. You can get those at like Walmart, Costco, that kind of thing. There's 22 channels that the FCC has allocated for FRS. This is what an FRS radio looks like. It operates on the UHF frequency. It has 22 channels. It's pretty easy. You just hit the menu, go to channel 11, go to channel 12, and push and start talking. Real easy. Yeah, it's a typical walkie-talkie. The downside with FRS is you're limited by the FCC on how much power you can use. Some channels are half a watt, and there's some channels that are 2 watts. Half a watt might go a mile or two. 2 watts might reach 20 miles. One time we went to Antelope Island, and we had these, and my son was listening, and there was somebody on Antelope Island down to Bountiful, and we could hear and talk to them 20 miles away. It was direct line of sight. They were probably up on the mountain, and we were down, and there wasn't anything between us. So you can go 20 miles, but typically 5 miles or less. There's an alternative called GMRS, General Mobile Radio Service, and all you have to do for that is just go to the FCC, pay a license fee of like $35 for your family. You don't even have to take a test. And they give you access to this, same frequencies, but higher power. You get two things. You get higher power. I think you can go up to 5 watts or something. And you also get access to repeaters for FRS, which I'll talk about repeaters. That extends your range. I'll talk about that in a minute. But for the GMRS, you get access to the repeaters and a higher transmitting frequency. And that you don't have to take a test for. So that's the first option, and without a license. So on that 1-11, they give you some lists of unlicensed personal radio service. So most of you are probably familiar with CB radio, Citizens Band. They tell you a little bit about it. It's got 40 channels. Channel 19 was real popular for the truckers. And so they would say things like, you'd hear truckers talking, and we used to have them when we were growing up. Breaker, breaker, 19 for a radio check. My name is Bojo. And you'd have some kind of handle, and you'd talk to the truckers. And it was kind of fun because they'd say, oh, there's a police guy ahead, or there's a traffic jam, and you can kind of talk to the truckers and get a road report real time. And so that was kind of fun. Or we'd say, hey, can you honk your horn? And they'd go, oh, oh, and we thought that was fun as kids. And so you can talk to the truckers or just use it for personal use. So we had 3 cars at one time because I'm the oldest of 7. So there were 7 kids, mom and dad. There was 9 of us. There was a couple times we had 3 cars and we all had radios and we were all talking to each other. So that's, one, you could use the FRS now for that purpose. But so CB radio has 40 channels, goes about 10 miles. Marine VHF for boating, 50 channels, goes about 20 miles. And the FRS, which I've talked about, 2 miles is what it says here. Multi-use radio service. I'm not sure what that one is, if that's the GMRS or what, but that's another option that it mentions in here. Okay, so those are some of the unlicensed and the licensed versions. Okay, so let's see. 1-13 talks about the FCC and licensing. There is what's called the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. And also kind of interesting to note, the call signs are like international. And they're used for not only amateur radio, they're used for TV stations and radio and even aircraft. So in the US, for example, all the aircraft have tail numbers that start with N for November, and they all start with N, and all the N numbers mean it's a US licensed aircraft. And your call sign as a pilot is the same as your tail number. So when you get your pilot's license, you're automatically authorized to operate on the aircraft band, which are VHF, 100 megahertz range, and your call sign is your tail number of your aircraft. So when you go from different aircraft to aircraft, your call sign changes based on what aircraft you're flying. With the FCC, you just get a license. You can use it for any radio, anywhere you're at. You just you're supposed to have your license with you. So they let you just print it off as they give you like a PDF or something. You print it off from home, and you got your license. Put it in your car, whatever.
Can you pick your call sign?
They do have what's called a vanity call sign program. So you get an initial issued call sign, and then you can apply for a vanity call sign. So for example, my instructor, the shorter call sign indicates more power and more privileges. So he had his call sign he applied for was NOAA, N0AH. So his was NOAA. I thought it'd be fun to have Adam, but I'll get into that more later, that they restrict the call sign based on the country you're in. So N, I'll give you the mnemonic. This is a little bit jumping ahead, but the mnemonic is AKNW, Alaska, Northwest. AK for Alaska and NW for Northwest. So if you remember AKNW, all call signs in America, in the US, have to start with an A, a K, an N, or a W. So like WBL Chicago is a radio station. KSL is a radio station, TV station, radio station. They all start with K, S, A, K, N, or W. So all the aircraft are N, and when I got my call sign, it was KC0QZS. It's based on the location where you apply. So I applied in Colorado, and this area of the country, they all start with K. If you hear somebody with a W call sign, that is in the East Coast. So you can kind of tell where people got their call signs. Sort of like Social Security numbers used to be. The first 3 digits used to be based on where you applied at the time you got your Social Security number. They've since changed that. Back to the ITU. So the International Telecommunication Union, that's kind of like an international body that has rules and regulations they all follow. These countries will follow, and they all coordinate that so that their call signs and their frequencies don't overlap and interfere with each other. And so anyway, so with the ITU, those are the call sign letters that we use in the US. Let's see, so 1-14, I've talked about this in the intro. We've got the technician, the general, and the amateur. They're called elements, sub-element 2, 3, and 4. I think element 1 is the Morse code test. That's why it starts with 2. But it's 35 questions. Passing grade is 26 out of 35 correct. So let's see, what is that? 9 questions? Or 7 questions wrong? 6, 4, my math, 9 questions, yeah, thanks. My math on the fly. Anyway, so you can get 9 questions wrong. 26 is correct or higher, then you can pass. And it tells you on the right what kind of privileges you can get. So with the technician, it's VHF and UHF, and general is those plus HF, and then extra gives you all privileges. So I've talked about contacts. Some of the lingo on 1-15 is called CQ. CQ is just a general call or a contact. So if you're on the, I don't do any of the Morse code stuff, so I don't do Morse code, like to communicate, but if you were, you would say CQ, 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 and that means calling anybody out there, can you respond? So CQ is just anybody talk kind of thing. On 1-15, they give you a little bit of the history of the word breaker. So we have in our lingo today, sorry, I'm breaking in on your conversation, or I'm interrupting, right? So that came from, the word originally referred to a telegraph operator disconnecting or breaking the telephone line so that no characters would be sent. This got the attention of every other operator along the line, and to do so was called breaking in. The word is still in use 150 years later, so that's where that came from. They also have what are called Q signals, which I'll go into those a little bit later, but telegraph operators adopted a little shorthand. They were 3-letter codes starting with the letter Q, probably because the letter Q wasn't really used in the English language, so they just did a bunch of 3-letter Q codes, and it was a shorthand way of communicating an idea. Like a QSO is referred to as a conversation, QSO. QTH, if you say what's your QTH, that means your location. So those are 1-15, they talk about that, those Q signals a little bit. There's a list of them later that I can go into. Now I'm going to talk about the different modes of communication. So most everyone's familiar with, the cell phone using data to transmit. Well, that data goes over the airways. It uses a frequency, 7, 8, 900 megahertz. They're all different standards depending on what type of cell phone network you're operating on, which carrier you have, and what frequency spectrum they're licensed to use through the FCC rules. So there's data, digital data. 116 talks about digital data. I've talked about Morse code, or CW. It stands for carrier wave. That's another way you can use the spectrum. Another mode is voice, which I've talked about. That's just picking up the phone, talking to people, which has kind of become a lost art now, right? We do texting. We mostly do data with our cell phone, but the same thing applies with ham radio. You can do voice, you can do data. They also give you access to send images and data. They also give you access to an ATV, amateur TV. You can set up your own little TV station, and you have certain spectrum where you can broadcast a TV station if you want. So that's another thing you can use. And ham radio can be as small as this. Okay, this one has the extra large antenna. You can unscrew it and put a smaller one or a longer one on if you want. They come in various, quality and so on. This one is a Baofeng. It's a really popular one. This one has the extended battery pack, so it's a little bit longer. The other one I have over there is about this tall from here up. This one has the extra battery pack. It's about $35. The one without the extra battery pack, the normal battery pack, is $20. So it's a very low barrier to entry if you want to do that. This one is a dual band. It operates on UHF and VHF. So you turn it on, and it has memory channels and things, and you can talk on it, push to talk. I won't go into the functions right now, but just to let you know, they are very small and portable. So then one of your first questions is like, how far can this thing go, right? What good is this? Who can I reach with it? So this one has 3 modes, a low, medium, and high power. The low power is about half a watt. The medium power is about 2 watts, and the highest power is 5. Most mobile radios won't go beyond 5. There's some that are 7, but 5 is sufficient to operate line of sight wherever you can see. So if I were to set step forward in my back window in my backyard, I can see from here to Provo. That's 20, 30 miles line of sight. I could contact with this 20, 30 miles. In fact, with the FRS radio, we were tuning it in, and we can see Provo Canyon from here, which is 20, 30 miles away. And we were hearing them use it for like climbing. They were rock climbing. They're like, hey, can you pull the carabiner up higher or whatever? We'd hear them talking right here in Saratoga Springs. So in Utah terrain, probably not unless you have a repeater, because you have the point of the mountain in between you. But let's see. Okay, so a repeater, I'm just going to give you a brief concept of a repeater. In Utah, we have mountains everywhere and flat valleys below, right? So the higher the antenna, the further the signal can travel. So they put a lot of repeaters on mountaintops and areas with access to some kind of road to get there to maintain it. And so they put these repeaters up there with access to power it and a road to get there. And what it does is there's two modes that are really commonly used for communicating voice, which is called simplex. Use the same frequency to transmit as you do to receive. The downside to that is you have to talk, wait, and then listen to the other person. You can't talk over each other like you might do in a real conversation. So you got to have some etiquette to communicate well. With the repeater, you transmit on one frequency and receive on the other. So I might transmit on frequency 100 and receive on 101. And so you program your radio in to do repeater mode, and it will transmit on one and receive on the other. So the idea is I talk, the repeater listens, and then it rebroadcasts my signal. So it might hear my 5-watt signal and rebroadcast at 150 or 200 watts right from the mountaintop. And now you might go 100 miles. So with this, if you had a repeater on the point of the mountain, which we do, you could talk here, line of sight to there, and then it would go all the way downtown. So in that case, yeah, you could easily reach downtown. In fact, there are repeaters on the promontory point that I can actually hit that are quite far up in altitude, and I think you can see some of them from here. So I'll talk about that later in more classes. But let's see. Okay.
So people that use that would be GMRS, or they would have like the basic certs. You don't need ham technician.
For the FRS or the GMRS, you don't need a license, but you're still limited to the power. It's only 2 watts instead of 5, or a half a watt depending on the channel you're operating on. And you don't get access to the repeaters unless you pay the annual licensing fee for your whole family. And there are very few repeaters that are GMRS around here. But I'll show you later a list of repeaters in the area. There's probably 100 repeaters in 100 miles of here. There's a lot of repeaters. And there's another, I'll just mention this briefly. Let's see, how are we doing on time? 30 minutes, okay. I'll mention this briefly. Another thing repeaters can do is they will hook it to like a internet connection. And so you talk to the repeater, and it converts your voice through data, like voice over IP, through the internet, and it goes anywhere worldwide. So they have one protocol is called IRLP, Internet Radio Linking Protocol. And so they link the repeaters from, say, Utah to Colorado to Australia to South Africa to England. So you can get on with this, talk locally, and you're talking to someone live in Australia. And so through those links, you can talk worldwide. You can't really do that with this because they don't support that on the FRS frequencies. So IRLP is one. There's another one called Echolink. There's a couple other different protocols that you can have access to. Now, another function of repeaters, some of them have what are called auto patches. So you can talk to the repeater, and if you're a member of the club and you pay like, say, $20 a year, they'll give you access to the auto patch. And then they'll give you the code, you put in the 4-digit code, hit enter, and then you can dial a phone number. And then you can talk to somebody using your radio. So let's say you're up in the mountain, you lost cell service, but you can see the repeater because it's up in the mountain. You're hiking or in a remote area, but there's a repeater in your area with an auto patch, then you can dial in and call somebody. Now, the only downside is whoever you're talking to, you're broadcasting their conversation. It's not a private conversation. And there are limits on what you can talk about, like you can't talk about commercial, like trying to sell your products or something. There's some of those things. There's also obscenity laws, you can't do that, and there's some other things that there's laws, we'll go into that later. But you can use it, just for an auto patch for dialing a phone number when you don't have cell service. I tried this during COVID. I took a little drive up to the American Fork Canyon, and I lost cell service about halfway up. And I tried, and I could still hear people on my radio, no problem. And I could talk to people down in the valley, and you could signal like I need help or whatever. One of our coworkers is on the what is that called? The Mount Temp TERT, is that what it's called? Yeah, it's like an emergency response. Yeah, so Timpanogos Emergency Response Team, one of our coworkers at work, he, two of them I think were members of that. And so they'll use ham radios to coordinate with first responders and rescuers. A lot of times they're rescuing somebody where there's no cell service. They'll use this, talk to somebody, and then they'll relay, hey, send an ambulance. Or they've actually saved helicopter fees. They're like, I think he's okay. Do you need a helicopter? No, I don't. And you save thousands of dollars because you tell them, don't bring the helicopter. We're okay. So that was a story I heard at our team meeting once, if you remember that one. So, okay, another thing. Let's see, table 118. I've talked about the Oscars, the satellites. 119, another mode of communication is called meteor scatter and EME. EME stands for Earth, Moon, Earth. You can actually bounce your signal off of the moon and use the moon as a natural satellite, and it'll come back and you can talk to somebody on the other side of the Earth. Now, the downside is it's a very weak signal and it's very faint. What I understand, I haven't done it, but what I understand is Morse code is really the only signal that is intelligible enough. Voice requires more bandwidth and a stronger signal. And so they'll do Earth, Moon, Earth communication through Morse code. So that's another thing that people do. Now, meteor scatter, this is kind of a really exotic form of communication. I've never tried it, but apparently it's a thing. A meteor comes in, you know it's coming in, and when it ionizes the Earth, it creates like a little mirror, and you can reflect your radio signal off of the meteor trail. And so they'll like, okay, let's reflect our signal off the meteor trail and use that as a satellite and bounce it off. So people do that too, apparently. Nobel Prize winner Joe Taylor wrote software that uses computer sound card to both send and receive data in this code and using meteor scatter and Earth, Moon, Earth at extremely low power levels. So anyway, there's all kinds of, crazy things people do with it. So I mentioned the process. So the process for getting your license, it's changed since COVID, and it's changed over the years since when I got it. It used to be you would pretty much go in person, and they have what are called VEs, volunteer examiners. And the FCC allows amateurs who are volunteers to administer and proctor the tests and to grade them and to send in the license and say you passed. And so the way I did it was they would have it like once a month or twice a month. You go to some place like a school or a library. They would proctor the test. You take the test. They grade it on the site. And in a few minutes, if you passed. If you passed, you get a copy that says you passed. And then they send in electronically to the FCC that you passed. And then once they have your record of you passing, then they issue your call sign. And you check the website to get your call sign. And once you got the call sign, you can begin transmitting. Now, since COVID, a lot of it's gone online. So you can go to the ARL website, arl.org, and look for exam sessions and find an online one. It's like your typical online proctoring, where you take a picture of your room before and you take the test or something. There also are licensing classes that are offered by certain groups. I went to check licensing classes, and there was one last week in Provo. It was at the fire station training room or something, and it was an 8-hour. You just go there 8 hours, cram in, try to learn it, and then pass at the end of the day. So you can do that if you want. But I'm not like the cramming kind of person. I'd like to kind of learn a little bit over time. It sticks better for me that way too. Let's see. So the testing process, 121 talks about that. You bring 2 forms of photo ID. You pay your fee. I think it's like $35. ARL has a special youth fee waiver program where you get $30 back. So it costs $5 for somebody that's under 18 to take the test. And so you get some benefits with that. Okay, so at the end of chapter 1-22 tells you the bands that you have access to. So these are the frequencies that you can transmit on. I will talk about those a little bit later in the class. On the right-hand side is the key of the data type of ways of communicating. So when it says CW about halfway down on the key area, that is carrier wave or Morse code. Phone is like voice. Image, you can send data, and there's
SSB stands for single sideband, so that's just voice, basically. So they tell you like where you can operate on certain frequency ranges, and then tell you the privileges. Oh, these are all the amateur bands for the extra, general, and technician. So if you look here in black, those are the ones you have access to, and if it has a T by it, then that's the technician. Those are the frequencies you get. Some of them, like the 12-meter band, says EAG. It's extra, amateur, and general. So you have to be a general or higher to get that. There used to be, A is advanced. There used to be a license called advanced, which they no longer have, between extra and general. They used to have another license called novice that they no longer have, so that's, you see that on the key there in the bottom right. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording for chapter 1. I'll pause for a few minutes, and then we'll go on to chapter 2, because this one's a little bit quicker.